Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the second online collaboration of the Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust and the Ammonoosuc chapter of New Hampshire's Audubon. My name is Gal Potashnik, and I'm the Outreach and Member Services Director here at ACT. I want to start by thanking the Ammonoosuc chapter of New Hampshire's Audubon for partnering with ACT on this event. We are thrilled to be continuing to find new ways to bring our communities together. And since we're still in the figuring it out stages of online presentations, it is great to see so many folks interested in joining this style of event. I'm excited to report that we had a whopping 65 people registered. There are 30 on the call right now and more to join, I'm sure. And we've got people as far away as Maine, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, which is pretty fantastic. The online forum really allows for that. Since turnout isn't waning, I think I can speak for both of our organizations when I say that we'll be hard at work to continue bringing online programming to you this summer and into the future. Those of you in the audience that are members of ACT and or New Hampshire Audubon, thank you so much for your support. As I'm sure you're aware, both of our organizations are doing all we can to continue serving our communities and find new ways to do so as the routine of our daily lives continues to shift. If you aren't already a member and feel you can make a donation at this time, please do so. We know you see the importance of the work we do and ask that you support it if you can. Finally, I have a few housekeeping items before I hand it over to Dave, our esteemed presenter. And thank you, Dave, so much for stepping into the presenter role. You were our second moderator on the last one, and we've promoted you, so great job. In the interest of keeping things running smoothly and with minimal confusion, everyone will remain muted with videos off for the entirety of the presentation. You can ask questions at any time using the Q&A chat function. If you're unsure of how to get there, wiggle your mouse and you'll see a Q&A icon pop up in the bottom right of your screen. Click on that icon for the chat screen to pop up and type your questions and hit send. Do make sure that you're either sending it to everyone or to the Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust so that I can see it as Dave starts to speak. Otherwise, I won't see it and Dave will have to wait until he's done talking to read it out loud. As I said, I will be fielding questions as they come in. And to keep things lively, I'll chime in throughout the presentation to ask a few questions here and there. So please don't hesitate to ask anything as Dave is presenting. There will also be a dedicated question and answer portion at the end. And depending on the number of questions, that will last up to 30 minutes or so. As I already said, we are recording, so be aware that that's happening, but we, as audience members, no one will be seen at any time. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Dave to get us started. Please enjoy, and thank you again for joining us.
Well, thanks, everyone. Gal, can you hear me okay?
I can.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome. This presentation, Wildlife of the White Mountains. I'm talking to you from Jefferson, New Hampshire, which is where this photo was taken at Cherry Pond. I think most of you are pretty familiar with this location and a view of the White Mountains. Quick background on myself: I'm retired from the U.S. Forest Service, and I've been a naturalist for a number of years here in New England and also in Alaska and elsewhere. So I enjoy wildlife observations, and I spent a lot of time doing surveys for various kinds of wildlife, including birds, but also mammals. And some of the photographs that I'll be showing tonight have been taken in the last couple of weeks. So I like to use recent photos to show you what's going on. So let's go ahead and get started. And the coverage tonight, I'm really focusing on the White Mountain region, essentially from the Lakes region north all the way up into Pittsburgh. And New Hampshire has a lot of varied habitat, but the White Mountains is, it's the crown jewel of New England in many ways. And so I'll be focusing on what wildlife we have here. I don't have time to cover all of the mammals, for instance, that we have. I'm leaving some of them out for a separate presentation, but there's a fair coverage tonight. What is wildlife? And I know that sometimes people think it's a fraternity party, but by the definition, the traditional definition is it refers to undomesticated animal species that live independently of humans in natural conditions. So we usually think of mammals and birds and maybe even fish, but we now include insects and flora, the plants that we have. And we have a lot of habitat. You know, we have beautiful streams and hemlock forest that provide habitat for some animals. We have lakes and ponds. This is Shoal Pond in the Pemigewasset Wilderness that has its own unique habitat for wildlife, such as the American marten, the spruce grouse, and Canada jays. We have our beautiful northern hardwood forest. This particular one is an old growth forest in Franconia. You're probably asking where. It's the Lafayette Brook old growth forest by the Hugh Galen Wayside area. Just a beautiful forest, and I've led several trips to look at that. And we have our beautiful spruce fir, the softwood forest. We have both the upland montane forest and the low elevation spruce fir forests that have their own unique wildlife. And of course, some of our favorite places are the alpine communities, such as this Bigelow sedge community. And I'll talk about one of the denizens, the animals that lives there, and that's the American pipit. And of course, we have all kinds of beautiful flowers, and the pink lady slippers are still in bloom. It amazes me that this late in June that we're still seeing lady slippers that are out. The rhodora's going by. This was 2 weeks ago at Little Cherry Pond, but you know, thinking about the plants that we have here, and in this picture we see tamarack and rhodora, and the rhodora is a plant that's important for pollinators, and of course it's important for us because we love the beauty that we get there. And the tamarack provides food for a number of bird species. They eat the seeds from the cones of the tamarack. And just a few days ago on Mount Washington, and we have that unique habitat there where we have these species that stay so close to the ground because of the wind. And we have the diapensia still coming out, that white flower that you see here, and the pink flower is the alpine azalea, and the purple, I think that's purple, is the Lapland rosebay, which is now called Lapland azalea. So let's move on. We'll be talking about some of the wildlife that we have here, and this is the eastern bobcat. And you know, most people just call it a bobcat as opposed to eastern, and this is actually the subspecies, and it's Lynx rufus rufus. That color red is where you get that rufus name. It's really named for its short, stubby tail. It has a lot of spots on it and predominantly reddish in color. They can be active any time of the day, but they're what we call crepuscular animals, and that's dawn and dusk, you know, that twilight zone that they have. They're a very good climber. Occasionally you'll see one taking a nap in a tree. They've got excellent vision and hearing, but apparently their sense of smell isn't that great. They love hunting from the tops of logs, and that's often because there's animals underneath there, particularly snowshoe hare, that love to get under these logs, and so they hunt from the top. So this particular animal, I believe it's a female, based on seeing it several times. It breeds in April, and the gestation is 60 days. So, you know, April, May, June. So there's probably some kittens that are out there. Males can be up to 27 pounds. Females are smaller, about 10 pounds smaller, about 17 pounds. And this was, you know, I took these pictures actually through 2 panes of glass this winter time, and this one was checking me out. You know, it has such great vision that you know, you move a little bit and it can tell you it's there. So it wasn't very far away. Kind of looks like a giant house cat. And this one was checking out uh, a squirrel in a tree and just looking at it. Check out that pink nose and that white underthroat area and stripes around here and the big whiskers. But those spots are really important. And also that black mark on the inner legs, that black fur, that's pretty characteristic of the eastern bobcat. And again, very good climbers. I actually had a suet feeder that was up with raw suet, and it ended up just batting the suet container until it knocked it down. And so I ended up having to go to the rendered suet. I didn't want to really attract bobcats to the house. I don't mind them chasing squirrels, but I used rendered suet and they would just walk right by it. Wasn't of interest, but the raw suet was something they really liked. Um, Closely related in that family, the cat family, Canada lynx. And this is a picture taken back in 2018. This is provided by New Hampshire Fish and Game. I did lynx surveys with them for 3 or 4 winters. Check out this animal. It's just an amazing looking animal. And if you really want to see a picture of one, this was taken last year uh, in Millsfield, New Hampshire. Look at those paws. I mean, those paws are huge. They're almost as big as my size 13 feet. And check out check out those ear tufts on it too. So just an incredible animal. And again, this was in success. Here's a couple of young kittens here that were in a picture. They love that spruce fir habitat. Lynx generally, they haven't found any that have gone south August Highway. So the range has been pretty much from, say, the Zeeland Valley, Pemigewasset Valley, north on into Pittsburgh. And we think most of the lynx came in recent years from Maine, where there's a fairly healthy population, somewhere over 500 Canada lynx, because a lot of industrial forestry is practiced in Maine for the pulp and paper industry. So a lot of clear cutting, which creates that habitat for snowshoe hare, which is what Canada lynx require. 80–90% of their food is snowshoe hare. And we've had a lot of clear cutting, particularly in the town of Success, New Hampshire, near Berlin. I think about 20 years ago, one of the loggers, everyone was yelling at him and shouting at him that he'd cut 6,000 acres of softwood forest. And, 5 years later, we started getting reports of Canada lynx moving in because the snowshoe hare had moved in. They love that regenerating habitat. So there's a good population of lynx near Berlin. But that picture, the last picture, was in the Zeeland Valley. Let's compare the two, and let's look at the ear tufts. On the left, Canada lynx, those are just enormous ear tufts compared to the ones on the right on the eastern bobcat. And then the cheek tufts. There's not much on a bobcat for the cheek tufts, but if you see where my little scroller thing here is, those are pretty big cheek tufts. And the color, it's really a gray color on the Canada lynx. And that's really one good way to tell. Of course, they do interbreed. They do hybridize. The male bobcats have been known to breed with female Canada lynx. And even though the lynx tend to be a little bit larger, the bobcat's a little bit more ferocious, and they will kill the male lynx. Here's a picture of some lynx tracks. We were doing a survey, and it's on a tree that had fallen down, and you can see that cats in general love to hunt from logs. And one thing, if you happen to have some land and you have a tree that's come down, lop off the top branches and create that that highway for cats to hunt animals from, and that could benefit the wildlife you have in that area. All right, so let's a question here. Yeah, go ahead.
I've got a question from Ernie, wondering about the life expectancy of the Canada lynx and the bobcat?
Well, um, both the animals, we're talking 4 to 6 years is expected life. Bobcats, some of it depends on the location, if there's hunting and trapping pressure, but 4 to 6 years for the two of them. That's assuming there's a pretty good supply of food. Okay, any other questions? Nope. Okay, we'll move on. Here's an interesting question here. So obviously it's going to be related to one of these tracks here, and you actually see what looks like a snow snake track. And I'll answer it for you. It was a bobcat. You look at the tracks; they're not the greatest in this particular picture I took, but you can actually see the toe impressions. And on a lynx, there's so much fur covering those pads. All you see is just a pad mark in the snow. Rarely do you see anything else. And it must have caught a snowshoe hare because it was dragging it back and forth through the snow. So kind of a neat thing if you're out and you're wondering, what was the story here? So it was a bobcat that had caught a snowshoe hare. So snowshoe hare, one of my favorite animals, also called the varying hare, and it's called a snowshoe hare because of its giant feet, just like the Canada lynx. And the lynx and the snowshoe hare, they're just really intertwined. One relies on the other. There's so many predators of snowshoe hare that just about anything out there that's a predator is going to hunt snowshoe hare. So varying hare, they change color in the wintertime. Unless you're out in the Olympic Mountains of Washington, there they stay brown year round. It takes about 10 weeks for them to change. And in the wintertime, these the fur on the hair on the snowshoe hare here, it's hollow, and so it's much much warmer than what you have at this time of the year, which is brown, because there's pigment in those hair follicles. The picture, this was an August picture. This was last year, and characteristically, they always have this white band around the ear. Just about every one that I've seen. So August, it's already starting to turn, and so much of life in nature revolves around the amount of daylight that we have here at this time of the year. So it's already starting to change here in this particular August picture. Another one, I seem to be able to find snowshoe hare in the at this time of the year quite easily. I saw two of them today, and typically a couple just about every other day. Here's one I took last week at Wambach Junction near Cherry Pond. I mean, it almost looks like a baby kangaroo out here with those really long ears, and very, very chunky looking. This one might be a female that will be out there. This one I took yesterday, and you can see some ticks on its face, unfortunately. And I took it by some railroad tracks. Don't look at the spikes and holding down that rail. I look a little bit loose there, but that's a story for another day. But baby hares are called leverets, whereas, well, what's the difference between a hare and a rabbit? Basically, hares are born with fur. They have eyesight, and they can move around within an hour. And they're still tended to by their mother. But baby rabbits, they're called bunnies, of course, and they're born hairless and blind and totally dependent on their mothers. And there's 5 species of hares in this country, and you might be interested in knowing that the white-tailed and also the black-tailed jackrabbit are considered hares. And there's a hare in Alaska called the Alaska hare, and another one in the Arctic called the Arctic hare. And they're considerably larger. Of course, in around Easter time, we always think of the Easter bunny as, with everything you see. But it was probably in Europe, it was probably an Easter hare, but it just doesn't roll off the tongue as well as the Easter bunny. So what does snowshoe hare eat aside from getting in your garden and eating the spinach and lettuce? They love to eat clover, grass, berries. They even eat ferns. Um, they, after the first frost, they typically shift to twigs, buds, tender inner bark of trees. And the habitat that they particularly like is where you have a mixture of softwoods such as spruce and fir and alder, aspen, and birch. And they love to be feeding on those. So here's a interesting thing on tracks. Now the direction of travel here, the two tracks on the left are actually the front legs, and the two big tracks are actually the hind legs. And so it's actually going from left to right. It's counterintuitive, but here's a picture that will show you that they really put those hind legs out in front of them. And they can jump 8 to 10 feet, and they can actually jump in the air 4 to 6 feet. And I've seen them do that when they're running. One of the predators of snowshoe hare is the long-tailed weasel, or ermine, and this is an animal that, well, gets up to 8 to 10 ounces, much less than a pound. It's a beautiful little animal. It's got a cream colored belly in the summertime, and it's primarily a carnivore, and we get them coming to our suet feeder. They love to go for that, and we also get one occasionally coming for the red squirrels, of which we have no shortage of it. But they have to eat about a third of their weight every day. They have such a high metabolism. So it's typically going to be one vole or one mouse a day just to keep them going. They tend to be really solitary. And the range, by the way, is the US-Canada border. I mean, they probably go a little bit further than the border, but essentially you might as well say that it's the US-Canada border for their range. Whereas the short-tailed weasel, which is closely related, and this is a summertime picture showing the animal. It's got a shorter tail, and if you take a photograph, and if the tail is 50% or less the length of the body, it's a short-tailed weasel. It's probably going to be a short-tailed weasel. They seem to do better in colder climates. If you go up on Mount Washington, 2 weeks ago, I was up there and I actually saw one of these short-tailed weasels carrying one of the kits or one of the babies, moving from den site to a new den site. And it was really interesting. The baby was all white. The difference between the long-tailed and short-tailed weasel, the short-tailed weasel, again, geographic range and altitudinal range, but also it has a white belly as opposed to a cream belly. And several years ago, I happened to see a long-tailed weasel that actually killed a snowshoe hare and was trying to drag it across a road. And it was about 10 times the size of this ermine. And so I said, geez, I don't want to get this thing killed, having somebody run it over. So I pulled up next to it, and the ermine, that's what it's called in the wintertime, came back towards me. I had the window open, and it got up on its hind legs, was chattering its teeth. I thought it was going to jump in. A friend of mine says, close the window, get you in the jugular vein. But that was the story on that one. All right, so moving on, let's talk about mink. This is a species that's in the weasel family, obviously, and it's larger and stockier than the long or short-tailed weasel. Usually we find them along streams, wetlands, ponds, and lakes. They love to feed on muskrat. And occasionally they'll actually even live in the muskrat lodges, which are, if you've ever been in some of the cattail swamps, they typically build them out of cattails. And they've been bred for a long time, as you know, for their fur coats. And I don't know how popular fur coats are anymore, but I don't hear of too many mink farms that are out there. And occasionally these mink escape and cause lots of problems, like they did in Iceland and England, where the American mink escaped and created havoc with fish and other species of wildlife. Next animal, moving on up, is the river otter, or northern river otter. Um, Very tubular shaped, sleek body. Very curious animals. Males typically larger than the females. They can get up to 30 pounds in weight, and they're 3 to 4 feet long. Typically a carnivore. They love fish, frogs, crayfish. Um, some of the ponds around here that have freshwater mussels, you'll occasionally see them diving for those mussels. And occasionally, if you go to a shore, you'll find all kinds of places that they've been into. In the wintertime, they love to slide down a hill. You'll occasionally see these wonderful slides. So obviously they love to play too. So typically we will see these family units of 3 or 4 animals. Sometimes the female will allow an older male to go along with the 2 young otters. And a group of otters, by the way, is called a romp. Maybe a new name for you, but they're just really neat to see, and they kind of look like sea serpents in some of the lakes and ponds that we have. And trying to count the numbers, because some of them, they're not synchronous when they go down, they're asynchronous and up and down, and trying to count them is a little bit difficult. But curious animals, and quite noisy too. If you happen to not be seen by an otter family, they are just really quite chattery. Next
Dave,
animal is the, yeah, go
Can
ahead,
I just
please.
wondering if you could spell the word that you said for the group of otters? I didn't have any idea what you said.
Oh, I called it a romp, ROMP.
Thank
Uh,
you. A romp. I
yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
romp, yeah, Romeo, Oscar, Mike, Papa. Um, so a romp, yeah, that's an interesting name. Okay, let's
Better
talk
than a
about our,
murder, I guess.
yeah, a lot better. Let's talk about the beaver, nature's engineer, Castor canadensis, and in many ways, it has such an important role in North American history with the Hudson's Bay Company and the fur trade and the settling of America. They can get up to 65 pounds. I think the record is 105 pounds. That's a pretty big beaver. Typically around here, we'll be looking at 30 to 40 pounds. Typically eat aquatic plants, leaves, tubers, particularly cattail tubers. They love the inner bark of trees, and that inner bark, particularly from aspen and birch. Those are the 2 of the favorites. And so what they do, they cache branches in ponds, and they stick the branches in the mud. They need a couple thousand pounds of food supply. They'll stick that in the mud, and when things freeze over, the beavers can come out and access their food. But if you look at it, a beaver is an engineer. It's a lot like humans in that we can change our environment. You know, we can build houses, they build lodges, they can build dams, and we can too. They can build canals. Uh, and so they definitely change their environment to suit their needs. Um, and just an amazing animal. They are very industrious, and the sound of running water drives them crazy. So they're constantly trying to dam things, and I've seen them use beer cans, um, rocks, and mud, and some places where there's no trees, they'll just dig up the hummocks and dam things up with that. Um, their homes are called lodges. They can either be in the middle of a pond, essentially surrounded by a moat, or in the case of rivers, they'll be on the banks, and they'll typically have a burrow. There's one entrance and exit that they can come in and out of, and there's an air hole on the top where they can get fresh air coming in. Beavers, you know, they have that castor scent gland, and that's what they use for territorial markings. And they create these huge mounds that they leave their scent on to tell other beavers not to intrude on their territory. They are very, very defensive on that. Also, if you have a beaver pond, you don't want to have your Labrador Retriever or another dog go in the water there to try to play with them, because if the adult beavers are protecting their kits, they're going to be very protective, and they'll attack the dog, and they can cause quite a bit of damage. And if you get a chance, take a whiff, not of the beaver scat, but of the scent mount. It's a very, very fragrant odor if you find a fresh scent mount. This is the scat. It's typically just like compressed sawdust that you find. It's about an inch by an inch, and not easy to find, but obviously they go in the water. This one I found by releasing a trail, and I thought it was interesting. Well, beavers do wonderful services for wildlife. They create great habitat, particularly for birds and other species of wildlife, but sometimes they get in trouble, like on this case of this power line. They blocked the culvert. They actually built the dam right on top of an old railroad grade here where there's a power line. This was the Coos Loop power line, which provides power essentially for most of Coos County. So this tends to create some problems with managers. And so they try to deal with this by opening up the block culverts or trapping out the beavers. And here's another example. This is on the rail trail at Pondicherry. And the beavers there, of course, quite active. They love to block the culverts, flood the trail. And it's very, very expensive, as you can imagine, to go and to open up the culverts and to replace the material that was lost in a washout. In Randolph, this spring, we had a couple of washouts on the rail trail there. And it was, probably $20,000, $30,000 worth of work to repair it. So one alternative is to put in beaver deceivers. I'll talk a little bit about that, and been involved in a project at Pondicherry this spring. And my job was to open up the beaver dam every day for several days to lower the water level so that we could put a pipe through the dam and a beaver deceiver. And I like those little potato hooks there. They tend to be the best. And the beaver deceiver, essentially, it's a long pipe, one of these culvert pipes, typically 15-inch diameter. And this one's 60 feet long, and it goes out to a baffle in the wetland where the beavers, it's probably 5 feet deep, 4 or 5 feet deep here. And the beavers don't dam around that. And this water level looks low. It's because we haven't had any rain in 3 or 4 weeks. So everything is pretty low right now. But that's how essentially it works. And this is the guy who's doing the work, Skip Lyle from Beaver Deceivers International. He's out of Vermont. He spent over 30 years of his life designing these structures to keep beavers out. And they're very, very effective. You consider the need to bring in a backhoe or an excavator to open up a culvert. It's just $150 just to deliver a backhoe to a site. And then it's $75, $85 an hour to operate it. And so you're talking several $100s just to open up a culvert that the beavers are going to end up blocking overnight. So what some road crews do, unfortunately, is they either shoot the beavers, which is bad at this time of the year because they're feeding their kits, or they trap them out, which is also bad because it typically kills the adults. So what we're doing here is we're coexisting with the beavers by putting in these beaver deceivers. We can keep the water level where we want it, and the beavers have a place to stay. Here's one in the wintertime. Lots of coyote tracks going around. No bear or anything like that can get into this, because once the mud hardens on these beaver lodges in the fall, it's like concrete. They can't get in. But there is a breathing hole on top, and you don't want to stick your hand down there because there is going to be a family of beavers there. Well, let's move on talking about moose. And I took this picture a couple weeks ago at Pondicherry. I was doing a bird survey, and it was in the morning, and I happened to be walking along a power line, which is a common place to see moose at this time of the year. And I happened to see a bull and probably a 2-year-old cow. And I said, I think I can get around. It was about 150 feet. The social distance that we typically use with most wildlife, and being very careful. All of a sudden, I hear this noise and this grunt, and I see a head coming out of the brush, and it's another moose with a yearling calf. And so I'm between two moose on one side, two moose on the other side, and behind me is a big swamp and then a bigger swamp in front of me. So I just waited them out. And this is the calf here. They tend to lose all of their fur this time of the year. And this one was intently checking me out. Keep an eye on the ears. If the ears of the moose are peeled back, that tends to be an aggressive posture. They were not interested in me at all. They were interested in this bull that was about 250 feet away. I was standing on a small bridge over a stream. They were kind of separated by this stream and checking out this bull to see what was going on. If you look at the left ear of this, you can see that it's forked. This I can only surmise is that it got into a fight with another bull, and when it got hooked with the antler of the adult of the other bull moose, and it tore. It must have been quite painful. Moose, they shed their antlers every fall, typically December, sometimes as late as early February. And so they're what we call deciduous, just like our deciduous leaves that fall off of trees. And they can grow up to 1 pound a day. And so it's an amazing adaptation for these animals. So it's a tremendous amount of nutrients that go into producing these antlers. And so they have this. And so you can have a rack that's 60 pounds, 70 pounds, and they use that for sexual displays. The bigger the rack of the male moose, the more attractive it is to the female. They use it for potentially show other bull moose that they're bigger and stronger. They'll use it occasionally for fighting. They that's one of the things they want to do last. And finally, because it's palmate shaped or cup shaped, they can hear the females better that way. So large bull moose, they're not as big as what you get in northern Canada or Alaska or Siberia, but they'll be in the range of 600-700 pounds. This is a younger one. You can tell that the rack there isn't particularly large, but it does have, every year it'll get bigger, and typically they'll be around for maybe 7-8 years if they're lucky. This one has this large hump in the back. That's muscle that's there that they use, just like on a grizzly bear or brown bear. They have that large hump.
Hey Dave,
Yeah, go ahead.
what do moose typically eat? Since they seem to be needing quite a bit of sustenance to grow those giant horns.
Oh yeah,
Antlers.
yeah.
What
Well,
are they getting all that nutrition from?
moose, they think the Algonquin translation of moose is twig eater. And so they're eating lots of woody material. And they're in the wintertime, a bull moose could be eating 40, 50, 60 pounds of material. This time of the year, they're eating a lot of the green vegetation, leaves and branches. But they love aquatic vegetation, particularly cattail tubers, which are quite large. They like them because it's high in sodium and other nutrients that they get. And they can actually dive down underwater. They're able to dive several feet down and pull these tubers out, and that's what they love to eat at this time of year. They'll eat bark in the wintertime. I'll show you some pictures here. I wanted to say before I leave this slide that this is a moose wall. Let me go back to that one there. Moose wall, and typically in September and October, the males, the bulls, this was actually a spring shot, but they love to wallow in these wallows. And if there's no water in that, they'll urinate in there, and they will actually roll around in there. And apparently it's very attractive to the females. So that's the one thing that they do there. This is what they eat. They love to eat browse. And if you go into a forest and you see what looks like bonsai, Japanese bonsai trees, it's because the moose have been browsing on these twigs. And typically it's going to be, aspen, birch, maple. Occasionally they'll do beech, but they'll also do softwoods too. And so they'll constantly browse this. And then, come next year, there'll be a new flush of twigs and branches and leaves. They'll come back in and they favor these particular ones. So it can really hurt the regeneration of some forest. And back in the 1990s, we would have these small clear cuts, and the moose would come in and they would eat so many of the young trees that were coming in there. It just suppressed the growth, and you didn't get that good regeneration. And finally, they were able to get overpowered. But occasionally, even in our yard here, we'll get moose come in and they'll be feeding on our shrubbery and trees, and sometimes they'll just take their jaws and snap off the top of a tree and feed that way. So you come out, you find these tracks all over the yard, and you find your shrubbery that's been chewed up. But they were here first. So here's often what they're doing. These are the signs that you'll see. They're browsing on that inner bark cambium layer, which is very, very nutritious. Lots of nutrients in it. That's what they're feeding on, and this is what they leave behind. Actually, not the lens cap, but these things that we call nuggets. And I had a post a couple weeks ago that I said, what is the New Hampshire moose gross natural product, or GP? I don't know economic GMP is, but I wanted to have people, it was a mathematical question of how many nuggets are produced in a year. And it came out to 1,417,500,000 nuggets per year in New Hampshire. So that's pretty good. So you say, how did you ever figure that out? Of course, there's about 3,500 moose that live in New Hampshire, according to Fish and Game. And I've been counting the number of moose nuggets per deposit, and a low of 40 or 50 to a high of 150. So I said an average of 100 moose nuggets made per deposit, and the average of deposits made daily is 15 of these. And so an average moose will produce about 1,500 nuggets per moose day. So a 600-pound animal, 1,500 nuggets, and a moose in a month we'll do 45,000 nuggets. And in our calendar, average is 30 days, and they only produce it though for 3/4 of a year. I could have put 9 months, but that's too easy. So I put 3/4 of a year. So I did the multiplication, and that's how I came up with it. So unless I'm proven wrong, but we've actually got some people that are trying to count the number of moose nuggets in a deposit. So send the information to me, and I'll keep you in the study. So at this time of the year, they're fairly soft plops, or cow patties, you might call them, because they're eating a lot of that aquatic vegetation. And so they're not nuggets for at least 3 months of the year. But what I find interesting, well, I don't know why, but they're called coprophiles. And on top of this dung, they actually have a fungus that grows. Little mushrooms, you might say. And my friend Rick Vanderpool, who's a mycologist and a naturalist and an ecologist, sent me these pictures here, and I've seen them, but his pictures were much, much better than mine. So when you check out these cow flaps, look for those moose dung fungus, which is, it's not rare. It just doesn't grow on those hard pellets that you see at the rest of the year. So something of interest. Moose are on the decline. I don't want to get into a lot of details, but back in the 80s and early 90s, that we were up 8,000 to 9,000 moose, and we're certainly much less than that. The estimate's around 3,500 moose, and a good reason for that is the tick population, the winter tick population. We got short winters that we don't get the snow until late in the year to cover up those ticks. We also have a problem with the brainworm that the deer carry. So that's been a bit of a problem too. I don't normally like to show a lot of graphs. I mean, this is not a college class or anything, but I did want to point out this particular thing because there's something we can do by being very careful on the roads during moose time. So I asked New Hampshire Fish and Game if they had a graph on what the roadkill was like in the last 30 years or so. And so they were very generous and provided me with this graph looking at the amount of moose that drivers hit per year. And it started off, their count started 1985, 1986. And so as you can see here, it was about 95, I think, that first year they started counting, but up around 1992, I think it is, very close to 300. And if you really look at for a long period of time, it was right in the 250 moose a year were being killed on our roads, and it was just a terrible slaughter. Sometimes you drive a stretch of road, say 100 miles, and you might see 2 or 3 dead moose on the side of the road, particularly in the months of May and June, and also in September and October. Last year, there were 88 moose that were killed by car collision. So just be really, really careful at night. Don't drive beyond your headlights. But the big problem is this winter tick infestation. We call these ghost moose because they've lost the fur. They try to rub the ticks off. There could be 30, 40, 50,000 ticks on them. So they're not only losing lots of blood, they're trying to get rid of them. And so they're scraping their bodies on trees, and it rubs all of the fur off. And so it's like us going out in the middle of winter without a coat. We're going to freeze to death if we're out there 24 hours a day. And it's a really tragic type of a thing. Well, let's move on from moose to black bear, one of our favorite animals. Been seeing a lot of them, and they're certainly out and about. The population is pretty good. We had lots of food for them last fall. This year we'll see what we have. They tend to eat a lot of grass. They are omnivores, meaning not only do they eat meat, they also eat vegetables, they'll eat fish, just about anything that they can get their hands on, including bird feed at this time of year. This one was in a rainstorm. I was just checking out our clothesline, and I opened the door, and it was giving me that evil eye saying, "What are you doing interrupting me here?" 2 weeks ago, I happened to be on a bike ride and with my wife Kathy and our dog, and my dog all of a sudden jumped up on its hind legs and was sniffing the air, and I encountered at a 40-foot distance a bear, a sow bear, and 3 cubs. And I said, social distance, 40 feet, that's not good. And so I quickly sped off, and about 150, 200 feet away, I was able to get a picture of this little black bear cub that had climbed up the tree, and his mother was telling me to go up there. The mother was woofing at me, so just protecting its young. So I gave it that social distance that it needed. But the black bears do climb trees. They are excellent climbers, and this is on a beech tree. They love to climb trees in the fall, particularly beech, but also black cherry, and to feed on the fruit or nuts that are in these trees. And sometimes in a beech tree or even a black cherry tree, you'll see what look like squirrel nest. And we call them bear nest, but of course we know that bears don't nest in trees. But that's because they sit in the crotch of a tree. They bite the branches, pull it towards them, and they eat the beech nuts, husk and all, and or black cherries or acorns, and then it just ends up looking like there's a nest up in a tree. Now,
Hey, Dave,
again, go ahead.
I'm going to interrupt you before you get too far off. I know for those of us that live in the area and might encounter a black bear on a trail or otherwise, what do you suggest we do other than obviously not walk towards it? Is there best practice for seeing black bears, especially with dogs, but even on your own?
Well, that's certainly a great question, and on how to deal with black bears at this time of the year. the mothers, the sows are with the cubs. They're very, very protective of them. But at the same time, they don't want to have get into a fight or altercation. The problem is when you get in between the cubs and the mother, that can be a real problem. So the key thing is maybe making a little bit more noise as you're going along the trail. Let them know that you're there. Some habitat has more, bears than others. In my case, I was on a bicycle and, it was just going along and I just happened to look up and there's a mother bear on its hind legs. So I basically, stood up. I'm 5'16" tall, and I slowly moved out of there and just, constantly reassuring the bear that I was not a threat. And I moved beyond 150 feet, and it was not an issue. And black bears, are not normally going to be trying to attack a person. I know there was a case earlier this week somewhere in New Hampshire where someone was mauled by a black bear. We don't know what the reason was, but that's what you want to do. And you don't want to run from a bear because that might want to create a situation where they're going to attack you. But generally, black bears are safe. I'm not worried about being out there compared to grizzly bears, where they can be pretty unpredictable. So another graph, sorry about all the graphs, but I thought you might be interested in seeing how many black bears that we actually have in New Hampshire. And in the White Mountains, it doesn't show on this thing, we have about 800 black bears, pretty high concentration. We have really, really good habitat. Of course, really wonderful denning habitat and all the rocks that we have around here. So overall population in New Hampshire this last year is around 6,000 black bears. Very, very healthy population. Now the goal, this is New Hampshire Fish and Game. Their feeling, based on, a variety of reasons, is that they want to have a goal somewhere around 4,700 black bears. And so that's how they adjust the hunting season for the bear, how many tags and permits they're going to be allowing. It had been around 5,000 was their population goal, but because of problems with bears in towns and cities and other localities, they think that 4,700 is a very healthy population, and it certainly is compared to many other states. Now there are some conflicts, of course. That the old saying is a fed bear is a dead bear. If they keep coming back to food and they recognize human food, leaving dog food out or particularly black oil sunflower seeds, they really love those and they can smell them a long ways off. So that can be a real conflict. This is the final chart, I promise. But I wanted to show you what the conflicts were by cause, and the biggest one, surprisingly, we could take the top 2 or 3, and we could pretty much eliminate half of the problems, but maybe 2/3 of the problems if we took care of these top 3 causes. Now, dumpsters in particular and garbage bags that are left out, 31% of the conflicts are caused by garbage and dumpsters, and there's bear-proof dumpsters. There's not bringing your trash out the night before for pickup if you have a town that has that pickup. There's a lot of things you can do. Bird feeding can be 17%. Normally we say it's December 1st to April 1st on feeding birds. This year is a little different. If you're going to feed birds, bring the feeders in at night, certainly, or when you're not there. And finally, chicken and poultry, 25% of the conflicts are associated with that. And corn, it looks like only 3%. Bears love corn, and I've done surveys adjacent to farms and running the bear tracks all the time. So interesting chart. All right, moving on here. I'll have to move fairly quickly here. Just a couple of the other animals you might be interested in. American marten, formerly called the pine marten. These animals are only 2 or 3 pounds at the most. They're about 2 feet long. They're carnivores. They love to feed on snowshoe hare, red squirrels, mice, voles, things like that. Live really in conifer forests. This is a picture I took up at Mizpah Springs Hut, 3,800 feet. It's in balsam fir forest habitat. Uh, these guys can live, 10, 12 years in the wild. Beautiful animals. They do come to bird feeders, and they love to steal suet. If you want to see one, get on the Crawford Path by 7 o'clock in the morning in the wintertime, and you have a good chance of seeing one. They love to use that trail. This is over at Shoal Pond, as you can see here. I was with a dog, my black and or blue tick hound that I had, and the marten was more interested in the dog. I'd never seen a peculiar looking dog like that. Probably seen people, but it was just checking me out and checking the dog out, and it was running around the tree making all kinds of noises. This one, I thought I was going to have to do the Heimlich maneuver on it. It choked on some food that some hikers had left for the birds, the Canada jays, at the Mizpah cutoff, and fortunately it coughed out the raisin or whatever, but beautiful looking animals. This is a trap for marten. And before you say that a trap is bad, it's actually a camera trap. And what it's designed to do is to take a picture of the throat patch, which is peculiar to each individual marten. And we got a twofer here. There's one here on its hind legs, and there's another one up here that's going for the bait thing. And so the camera took a picture, and the biologists are able to make a catalog of all these throat patches, just like the marine biologists use for humpback whales on the flukes of the humpback whales. And this is what the trap consists of. It's a sardine bait trap, and they have a good sense of smell. And this one was off the Kankamaugus Highway. So pretty neat study that Fish and Game is doing. And the next larger size is the Fisher. And this is in the weasel family. This would be, 10, 12 pounds in size. We sometimes hear it called a Fisher cat or a black cat. You occasionally see that. Really dark brown. Legs typically are almost black. They love the mature forest, and they will actually come to bird feeders too. They're looking for suet. They're looking for squirrels and mice and voles. They also will eat red squirrels. And here's our next one. There's no shortage of red squirrels, although this year seemed to be fewer than years past, but there's still a bunch of them out. There's a little chatterboxes. Beautiful, beautiful animals. Body is typically rusty red in the summertime, and it turns gray in the wintertime. And I think most people don't realize that it turns that color there. There's a black line, as you can see on this particular photo, that separates the belly fur with the upper body fur that you see. So they're an omnivore, and if you have a lot of red squirrels, they're going to be eating bird eggs and bird young, but typically they like conifer seeds and mushrooms. They'll harvest those conifer seeds and put them in caches that are called middens. And occasionally these middens will be, attract bears, and the bears will take it all. They roost in natural cavities or in your garage, I guess, in some cases. Of course, this year we have a few chipmunks around, and it's just an incredible explosion of chipmunks all around New Hampshire, and I guess in Vermont too. And the chipmunk, it's in large part because we had a pretty good food crop last year, but I don't see that many gray squirrels around compared to last year when we had that Squirrel-mageddon. But check them out. They have these two black stripes that separate the white stripes on each side. They're actually a true hibernator, and I see them in very early April in the mountains, and they'll start breeding right after that. Last week I was up in 5,700 feet in elevation on Mount Washington. I saw a chipmunk up there. So, they're going to be looking for bird eggs and things like that. Typically, they're seen in the daytime. And related to squirrels and also in the rodent family is one of our favorites, the woodchuck. Took this at the Whitefield Airport last week, and it was hiding under a pallet, checking me out, and I was trying not to corner it, but of course it was with a telephoto lens, and it has that really rich red belly fur, typically found on the farm fields, edges of power lines, and that. Um, they've gone up pretty high in elevation too, up in the mountains. It's in the marmot family. Porcupine, I'll briefly describe these. These are eaten by fisher. They're able to get at them, and also Canada lynx. It's about 30,000 quills in these things. And these animals, typically the porcupines will be eating the inner bark of trees like the tamarack or the hemlock or even the sugar maples that we have. Black spruce they'll occasionally go for. And they can live for several years. And they typically, you'll see them in branches trying to warm up in the wintertime, but it's a rodent. And they do cause a lot of problems. They usually are nocturnal, but you'll see them in the daytime too, occasionally on the side of the road where they've been hit by a car. And what else can I say? That's about it on that. Oh, an albino, pink feet, pink eyes. It seems that porcupines have a high incidence of albinism. This one, really a cute thing. A friend of mine thought he saw a panda bear in a tree, and he came over, and we went out and checked at night, and sure enough, it was just an albino. Well, I'm near the end here, so hang on. A few other animals, and then a few birds, and then we'll open it up to questions. Red fox, again on the plowed snowdrift here. It might have just caught a mouse or something. White tip to the tail, beautiful animal. They're found all the way on up into the Arctic regions. The one fox that we don't often see is the gray fox. The gray fox, smaller than the red fox, shorter legs, very short muzzle on these animals. They're very, very beautiful animal. They weigh about 8 to 10 pounds. Sometimes they're called a tree fox because they can actually shimmy up a tree. They love to eat apples, and they can get up into trees. So, some other people say they're the missing link between the cat and the dog, but this one's eating a sparrow of some kind. It's not a junco, but probably a sparrow. They typically forage in open fields, and they'll often be around towns, and sometimes they'll get under the foundation of a barn. A friend of mine just sent me this picture from a couple days ago. He had a game camera that was $90 game camera, and this was taken at 7:30 in the morning, and you can see this beautiful gray fox. And check out this black stripe on the tail. That's very common on gray fox. And not easy to see a gray fox. We see a lot of red fox, but unless you have habitat for a gray fox, they're not that commonly seen. Well, let's talk really briefly about some of the other special wildlife that we have in the White Mountains and the North Country. Mink frog is one. We're at the range from here north that we see the mink frog. It has an odor. If you ever put it up to your nose, it smells a little bit like onions, and it makes a very distinct call in our wetlands. It's kind of like a chop chop that we have. And this dragonfly, I was trying to come up with the emblematic species of the White Mountains, and this is the one for dragonflies or the odonata. This is ringed emerald, beautiful, but it's only found in the Presidential Range and in the Franconia Range and in the White Mountains, of course. And it only breeds on high ponds that are at least 1,800 feet and above in elevation. And actually one of two dragonflies that will breed in the Lakes of the Clouds on Mount Washington at 5,200 feet in elevation. So this is our White Mountain dragonfly. And just like we have dragonflies, there's a couple of butterflies and actually a moth, an Arctic moth that we have on Mount Washington. We've got the White Mountain Arctic. I'm sorry, let me go back there. My finger slipped. On the left is the White Mountain Arctic, a very cryptically colored butterfly. It's actually a subspecies of an Arctic one, and it's like its neighbor here, the White Mountain Fritillary. These are species that are really only found, in the case of the Fritillary, only in the presidential range that we have here. They like this alpine goldenrod. And these are relics of the Ice Age. So they've been stranded here for 12,000 years since the glaciers left. And there's a number of these species that are out there. Some of the spiders that are up there, certainly 120 of the plants that we have up there are these Arctic relic species. And we've got some insects like this alpine boonie grasshopper. It doesn't have any wings, so it's not going to fly up into the Arctic to get back with its buddies. It's stuck up there in the high elevations of the White Mountains. So that's part of our wildlife that we have. And of course, we've got the American pipit, which tends to breed in these rocky areas from roughly 5,000 feet in elevation up to about 6,000 feet. So only on Mount Washington and in New England or in the eastern United States, only two places. You're going to have them on Katahdin, a pretty high elevation, and also on Mount Washington. And then in Quebec, there's another disjunct population in the Chic-Choc Mountains that you have pipits. Then you got to go all the way to the Arctic. And so last week I was up with Chris Martin doing a pipit survey, and we found 11 territories. And it's amazing. These birds are they have site fidelity. They come back year after year, the same habitat, and they seem to be doing pretty well, surprisingly, for such a small area. This one, a friend of mine, Garth McElroy, took a picture of the Bicknell's thrush, endemic to the higher elevation peaks of the northern Appalachians. They're in the Adirondacks and some of the Green Mountains, and of course, New Hampshire, Maine, and on into Quebec, but pretty much a local species. Blackpoll warblers, you'll have them in Canada and of course in Alaska, and they go several thousand-mile flight every fall and then every spring again. But this is the warbler that you have above 3,000 feet in elevation in the White Mountains. And of course, the boreal chickadee. And I don't know if you can hear it in the background. A boreal chickadee is, again, typically 3,000 feet. It's in that spruce fir zone. You don't find them in Portsmouth or Manchester or Nashville. They're up here in our beautiful White Mountains. And the black-backed woodpecker. Again, it's the White Mountains north that you get this particular species. And it has three toes, like its relative, the three-toed woodpecker. Canada, jay, one of my favorites. This one was off the Crawford Path. Beautiful bird. And again, you don't find it south of the White Mountains unless it's a thing. And finally, the spruce grouse. This is a male spruce grouse, and you don't find them south of the White Mountains. So it's something that we can really celebrate that we have up here in our lovely mountain region. And that concludes the program there. Thank you very much. I left my email address up here in case you have any questions. And let's see if we do have any questions.
Not seeing anything yet, but
okay.
I do have a question about building habitat for getting some of this wildlife potentially near or on somebody's land. I know at my house, I've got lots of red squirrels that are trying to get all of the insulation out of my house, and I would love to get some marten to take care of that. Do you know if there's any way to sort of build habitat, or is there a resource that folks might be able to look to for doing something like that?
The best bet is to contact UNH Extension, and in the case of Coos County, it's Brendan Prusick, and talk with him about that. But as far as getting predators, you look at the red squirrel, for instance, and you'll find that there's quite a few different animals that will feed on red squirrels, and owls are one. Broadwing hawk is another predator. And so think about those species. You're probably, even though Dalton's a lovely mountain area, you're probably not going to get marten commonly found there. They're typically found in more of the spruce fir high elevation forest, but you might get fisher, and you'll certainly get the weasels there. So think about creating the habitat for those predators that will prey on the red squirrels.
Great, thank you. Very personal answer. I appreciate that. Does anybody have any other questions? We have about 15 minutes or so that we allocated to questions. No pressure, obviously, but if anyone's got anything, we'd be more than happy to put it out there. Oh, actually, you know what? I did have a question from a woman named Leslie. She wanted to know if you knew where to find the northern bog lemming. She said that you would love this question, and she says hello as well.
Well, there's been no recent sightings of the northern bog lemming. That habitat is found in these cold sphagnum bogs, and it's part of the reason is we haven't done any surveys specifically for the bog lemming recently. They don't. Let me change this right here. They don't typically go into the traps that are set for them, but there are certainly some in Canada. The northern bog lemming is found there. Northern bog lemming probably have them in the White Mountains. It's just we haven't found them. Probably some in Maine. It's a source that we really should be doing some studies on, and I hope some funding can be found to do that.
I have another question here from Ernie.
Okay.
What do you do if you meet a moose in the wild?
Well, it depends on the time of the year. You want to keep that social distance, and particularly in September and October for the bulls, you don't. They can be pretty ornery at that time, and also in June and July. uh, for the cows that have their calves, they're going to be pretty protective, and those they can really kick with those hooves that they have. Um, in the case of the fall, I know people that love to call. They have these moose calls, and they're pretty good at calling them in. But you better have a tree that you can climb. So the key thing is these moose are making a lot of noise, and you can probably hear them. It's just try to avoid them. Don't antagonize them. And if you need to, hide behind a tree and give them the right of way so that they can get by.
Are there any areas that you'd care to share as far as extra special wildlife areas to view some of these cool species?
Well, the areas that I find that are the best, and it's more the timing of the day. You really want to get out there around sunrise. A lot of these animals, are moving around at that particular time. It's cool. If the temperature is, say, 75 degrees or more, don't count on seeing a moose. It's too warm for them. They're going to be lying down in the cool bed areas that they have, or they're in the water. So I would say, one of my favorites is these big power lines. And if there's a trail along one of them, it's really brushy. There's a lot of habitat there. You'll often see bear, snowshoe hare, and moose along these things, and all kinds of other animals that are there. Of course, it's also full of ticks too. So you have to be careful with that. We used to go up into Pittsburgh and Moose Alley and places like that, but there's a lot fewer moose that are being seen there. But still, you can get up there very early in the morning and check that out. One of my favorite places to see wildlife is actually over in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and that's on Route 105 out of North Stratford, New Hampshire, which goes to Island Pond. And there's a couple wildlife management areas there. There's the Nullhegan National Wildlife Refuge, part of the Conte, and there's the West Mountain and Wenlock wildlife management areas, and I often see moose over there. And of course, all of these interesting boreal bird species are there too. So that's one of my favorites.
I didn't think I'd ever hear you promoting Vermont.
I used to live in Vermont. Yeah, I
Awesome.
like.
Learn
No,
something new every day.
yeah,
I
yeah,
do have another question here, another actually nuisance animal question from Roz. Is there a way to lower the population of chipmunks around my house? They are
yeah,
digging
yeah.
up bulbs and doing other damage.
Yeah, what I've been reading about is these have-a-heart traps, and catching them, and bringing them several miles away and relocating them seems to be the best thing. That would be the one that I would recommend. So buy a have-a-heart trap. They're pretty easy to catch, particularly if you use peanuts. They love peanuts, and and there's going to be a lot of them. I mean, they do have two broods a year. And of course, we're seeing a lot of them because when they came out, they had a pretty mild winter this winter, April. So we got a number of young, and then they're going to be having another brood sometime this summer. So they're gonna continue coming, and they do eat a lot. I mean, they're actually eating butterflies. We're getting reports of butterflies that puddle in these sides of the road where there's some mud, and the chipmunks will go out and they'll eat the actual butterflies, and so they can cause a lot of damage. I like chipmunks, but again, everything in its number. So try those have-a-heart traps. Drive them 11 miles away before releasing. Why 11? That must be a magical number, because a lot of these animals, they just have this innate sense that they're gonna come back. I would trap red squirrels, and I made sure I went by a major river, and would drop them off. I used to drop them off by the house of a colleague I worked with. He never caught on, but I'm sure he did things to me like that too. Uh, but that's what I did. 11 miles. That's interesting. Next question.
So I don't see anything else over here, although Carol Wharton said she may have sent a question to you directly. Do you have
Okay.
anything there on your
Oh,
own?
yeah. I understand mink emit a very foul odor when threatened, and they do. Um, yeah, it's one of those things that they're able to do. Like some of the snakes and some of the turtles can do. Um, so they do have a particular fragrance that they have when they are threatened, and it's and also, if you're a scatologist, a person that studies scat or animal signs and tracks, you can get pretty familiar telling the difference between various animals. I mean, we can all do a skunk, I think, but you can actually refine it between a gray fox and a red fox, and that. But so there are some different fragrances there. And let's see.
Um, Dave, also wondering, as far as different wildlife, we may not always see them, but sometimes we hear them. Is there a way to tell the difference, let's say, between a red fox and a gray fox, or are there any specific calls that you could share with us, or some
Um,
things to listen out for, other
I
than
want
the
to
squirrels? Obviously, we know what they sound like.
yeah, the squirrels and chipmunks. So we're very familiar with the chipmunk calls now. Uh, that's a great question, and to be honest, I can't differentiate the difference between a red and a gray fox. I will research that though, and check that out. And certainly, we know the sounds of moose and deer, and actually snowshoe hare can make a real shriek too. I'm thinking, I've heard bobcats. I've heard certain woodchucks. They have they call them a whistle pig, and we're probably familiar with them if we had a farm or a garden as a kid, or even now we know what they sound like. But the fox one, you've stumped the chump on that one. I'll have to look that one up.
Oh, well, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Oh, that's good. I,
But maybe that'll be a follow-up to some of the information is a few of the calls so that folks can recognize them as they're kind of hanging outside.
The bird the bird community has from Cornell and these other sources, they have these incredible tapes that you can get and downloads, and so you can even get the dialects between a particular bird that's found in Utah and also Arkansas and also Minnesota and New Hampshire, and so you can actually hear what their calls and their songs are like, and there isn't that much out there for wildlife other than occasionally the trappers will have, or hunters will have, some of these particular calls for the game animals, but not too many out there.
Okay, well, it looks like our questions are all good for now. So I'm
Oh,
going
great.
to take you off the hook and take it back here. Thank you so much, first of all, for an awesome presentation. I know
Well,
I
thanks.
enjoyed that thoroughly.
And it is
Um,
recorded, so folks want to
that's right. That's
see it
right.
again.
Absolutely. And I will be also working on some closed captioning. So if you know anyone that might need something like that to be able to enjoy one of these recordings, please keep an eye out for that. Dave, thank you again. If there were any questions that didn't get answered, you guys please feel free to contact Dave or I at any point with an email. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and we can't wait to bring you some more programming in the future, so please keep an eye out for those events. Have
All
a
right.
great evening, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, everyone, and stay well.